Akunan, haunted ship. 3 encounters. While the ship is in port, most of the equipment in the reactor and machinery rooms is shut down and everything is aligned so that only a skeleton crew is needed to maintain the equipment. In the machinery rooms, which contain the propulsion machinery, distillers, and electrical generators, this consisted of 1 shutdown watch and 1 roving watchstander, with occasional visits from the crewman who was the overall supervisor for the plants. The machinery room has 3 levels. The topmost level, 4th deck, is a single story high, and there is a steep staircase that descends about 30 or 40 feet into the middle level, called the upper level, and another that goes down another 10 feet to the lowermost level, called lower level. On upper level was a desk, at which we spent most of our time while on shutdown watch. There's very little to do while overseeing a shutdown engine room, so between about 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., the shutdown watch tries fighting against falling asleep, while simultaneously staving off boredom. Unless you're in number 2 main machinery room around 2 a.m. Like I pointed out, there's a long steep staircase from 4th deck to upper level, and it had a tray along the underside made of aluminum. It was impossible to sneak down the steps, because the slightest vibration would start the aluminum vibrating and rumbling. Think about those sheets of aluminum they used to make thunder sound effects. When 2 a.m. rolled around, the sounds of footsteps and rumbling would be heard, and the tray would be seen to vibrate. Then, there would be the sound of a foot on the metal deck plate, and if you were sitting at the desk, you'd then see a man in a khaki uniform stop at the bottom of the stairs, turn to his left to face you, smile and nod, then turn to his right and walk around the distiller and out of sight. The first few times I blew it off as some watch supervisor doing his tour of the plant, and would wait at the desk to review my logs. He never came back, so I asked about it. Shouldn't the watch supervisor check my records every time he comes down? He should, but he came and checked my records before you went on watch and said he wouldn't be back until morning. When did you see him? About 2 a.m. Oh. If you find anything out, be sure to tell us. Nobody would tell me what that was supposed to mean. A week later, I was on that late watch again, as the new guy, loser equals me, and found myself struggling to stay awake, even with coffee and the ventilation making the place into a freezer. I was wide awake, though, when I heard the footsteps. Getting caught sleeping equals you are so very fucked. Sure enough, same thing, look, smile, around the distiller. I called out to him, "Do you want to review my records?" and followed him around the distiller, but didn't see him. I picked up a phone and called to the control room to have him paged. They informed me he was not in the plant, but had asked for a 5 a.m. wake up. Next time, I was set to find out what was up with this guy. I thought maybe he was some clueless guy from damage control or deck doing a tour of the ship and not knowing he wasn't supposed to be in a restricted area. I heard the steps, and got up from my desk. I got my first good look at the guy and realized that I couldn't make out a lot of details about him. He walked around the distiller and I went the other way to intercept him. I rounded the corner, and saw nobody. The guys I worked with told me their experiences were the same, that nobody had ever gotten any response from the ghost but a smile and a nod, and that nobody had been brave enough to get close enough to him to see what happened when he rounded the corner. If anyone was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, he would not show, and only rarely did he appear to both the shutdown watch and the roving patrol watch. I tried this on several occasions, and he only appeared once. Story number 2. There are a series of compartments that contain the bearings for the shafts that run from the turbines in the machinery rooms to the propellers at the aft end of the ship. Known as shaft alleys, they double as auxiliary equipment, pump rooms and storage areas. 2 such rooms have steam generators used to produce the cooking and heating steam for the ship. One is divided into 2 levels, and is accessible by a ladder running down a 7-story vertical shaft. Several hatches are spaced along the shaft. In that room, the steam reboiler has an alarm panel. When the water level gets too high or low, an alarm sounds. The watchstander then has to turn a knob from on to standby to silence the siren. When the water level is normal, another sound is heard, and the knob can be returned to its normal position. I had heard stories about strange workings of that panel, but it had recently been overhauled and was found to be mechanically and electrically sound. I was working on repairing some valves on the lower level when one of the alarms came in. I stood up and walked toward the steps to the upper half of the room when the alarm silenced. I went back to work thinking that it was a spurious activation. It happened occasionally, and was expected and tolerated, to a degree. Soon, the sound of the alarm clearing came in and was silenced. I checked the panel, all the knobs were in the normal position and everything was in spec. Back downstairs to work, and another alarm came in. I walked to the panel, checked the water level gauge, and sure enough, it had risen too high, but was starting to come down. The high water level alarm was in silence position. I was the only one in the room, and the hatch above my head was shut securely. A little nervous, I went back to work. The alarm cleared, and on inspection, the switch was back in its normal position again. This continued for a few more cycles, and each time I investigated, the switches were alternately in normal and standby positions. Getting very freaked out, I turned the switch that cuts the sound of the alarms out and tried to forget the weirdness going on above. 15 minutes later, I nearly pissed myself when an alarm sounded. Sure enough, when I got there, it was in standby and the cut tower switch for the audible alarms was back to normal position. I had heard some stories about other goings on in that space, such as hoses coming off their racks and falling to the floor next to a pocket under the floor that needed to be pumped out, or ropes and hoses moving back and forth while the ship was still, and then experienced the one that I'd been told about most frequently. Above me, I heard footsteps on the metal deck plates. A quick inspection of the hatch showed it was still shut. I figured someone had been hiding and was fucking with me all along, so I went upstairs to see who was making the noise. Nobody there. I heard the footsteps downstairs and ducked to look. There are only 2 ways to get from the upper to lower deck, and they're only 30 feet apart. Nobody. I went back downstairs to pick up my things and heard the footsteps above. I shouted out, "I don't believe in you, bitch," and heard a few quick steps on the floor moving toward me, followed by a slap against my wrist that sent my pen flying across the room. I was through the hatch and up the shaft in record time, shutting and securing every hatch on the way. I refused to go back down there for weeks, and after that, did not go alone. Story number 3. In another shaft alley was a cage with a lot of old equipment. People used to hang out there to smoke and BS, because, although it was against the regulations, it was more convenient than going to the designated areas and nobody ever came down to check out the room. Even so, there was always an uneasy feeling there, and nobody stayed down there for more than 20 minutes or so, claiming that they started feeling bad vibes. A few times, people who spent time there, myself included, claimed to feel a malevolent presence staring at them from the shadows inside the cage. Investigations. One friend of mine had his wife send him a Ouija board and offered to let us use it. We snuck it into the various spaces we felt were haunted and tried to contact whatever spirits were responsible for the odd behavior in the rooms. We got minimal response in the machinery room, and I was not present for the attempts in the reboiler room, but was told I didn't get much response there, either. So, into the creepy room we went. Jackpot. We managed to contact somewhere between 4 and 6 separate entities, but we suspect that it was 2, plus one that answered by several names to deceive us. Nobody else was knowledgeable with religious esoterica, numerology, or Kabbalah, so I asked questions on those topics as a test of the spirits, and to be sure nobody was fudging the board, with very positive results. The spirit in the machinery room was the first attempt. After determining that it wasn't someone else pushing the pointer, I asked it, "Who are you?" "K-H-A-K-I. "That's what we call you, but what is your name?" "No. K-H-A-K-I. M-Y-N-A-M-E-I-S-K-H-A-K-I. "Is that because that's the name we gave you? Or because you don't want to tell us your real name?" "Yes." "No." We could get no further with its name, after several attempts. "Why do you walk down the stairs?" Where do you go after you walk behind the distiller? Nosleeping. HearladdernotSleeping. What happened to you? Were you sleeping? Fire. Sleeping. Fire. And you want to make sure we're not sleeping? Yes. Kekke didn't tell us much else, and gave vague and contradictory answers about the fire in question. We asked around, but nobody knew of a fire in that machinery room, although it is very possible one did occur. We were unable to find any records of a fire, and when I left the ship, the walkthroughs were still going on. Contact with the thing from the reboiler was tougher, and at times we were not sure we were always talking to the same entity, so we would test it to be certain. In the end, we were fairly sure that the entity was confused and had a short attention span. Conversations were very short and it often strayed from the topic at hand, or asked us to sing a song before it would talk. Some of the others tried contacting it under varying circumstances, and told me the only information they got that seemed consistent was that the ghost, who they called Patrick although it usually referred to itself as me or the captain, seemed to be that of a young boy who loved ships and who had visited the Vincent and was shown the machine with the red lights and the siren. It seemed implausible, since civilians were not allowed in the space, and certainly not a small boy. However, the stories, checked by independent testers, came up the same each time. Over a few weeks, he became more talkative, but did not answer many ship-related questions, instead asking us about places we'd visited on the ship. We tried to speak to the thing in the cage and met with a lot of resistance. Either the board would not work, or it would spew forth random letters or obscene words, or it would behave in a very difficult or contrary manner. We suspected that most of the entities, as mentioned above, were this single ghost playing tricks. It claimed to be a woman who died in the 1920s, long before the ship was built, a mechanic who died on the ship, and the devil. When using the board to speak to it, the malevolent feelings grew and people using the board began to feel very paranoid and uncomfortable. After one argument with it about my intentions when contacting it, IHATEYOU. FUCKYOURNUMBERSANDQUESTIONS. WEHATEYOU, I did not try to speak to it again. In time, they began to ask for specific people to use the board, and would not talk until they were brought to the room. 6 of us held a conference and decided that we didn't want to pursue it any further, as some of the guys were really shook up over the incidents and those seemed to be the ones that most often requested. Our investigation stopped shortly thereafter and my friend took the board off the ship after several of the newbies who had heard about the ghost continued to pester him about borrowing it.